get started. So, hi guys. Welcome to my reading. I usually, at request, a double-size reading rather than a half hour because I blab a lot. So that's why we're here like this. What I usually do is I usually answer questions and talk a little bit before, then I do a reading, then maybe I'll do some more, then we'll just see how it goes and how much time we have for these various parts. I have brought the entire text of Oathbringer to read to you. Yes. So I'll give you some options out of that in a minute. For those who don't know, the book is going through beta reads right now. So my process for writing a book is I finish the first draft and I just kind of blah it out, right? Just try to go beginning to end. Now, Stormlight books are really big. So what I generally do is I break them up when I'm outlining them into a trilogy that I then bind into one book. This is how the plotting process goes. So when you read Words of Radiance, it's actually a full trilogy stuff to do. Same with Oathbringer. Way of Kings was a little bit more ad hoc in the formatting and things like this, but it's become very easy for me to say, okay, we're writing a trilogy, and then we're inserting the interludes and things like this, which are a short story collection, so we're binding 4 books in one, and that allows me to do certain things, knowing, you're going to theoretically read it all the way straight through unless you get horribly bored. Hasn't happened to any of the beta readers yet, so that's a good sign. I started outlining this one in earnest right after I finished the other one. In fact, the very first things that I wrote were some scenes from Kaladin's viewpoint. And I've done some readings on those, so there's a few people who have heard some of those readings. Those are a little spoilerific for the first 2 books. And I don't like to necessarily spoil people who haven't gotten to one of the early books yet. And so I try to target my readings toward things that are not going to be as big as spoilers. So once I finish some of those exploratory scenes, I've talked about this process a lot. I'll often write a few scenes for a book and then go back to the outline and spend a lot of time outline, then maybe write some more scenes and then go back to the outline and work back and forth until I've got a really good feel for how the outline is going. The next thing that I wrote for Oathbringer were the Dalinar flashback chapters. So each book in the Stormlight Archive, one of my worries with it is, having read a lot of long epic fantasies and learned from them, it feels like later in epic fantasy series it's often very easy to lose track of which book is which and what happened in which book and some of these things. And so one of my goals was to find a way to make each book of the Stormlight Archive have its own kind of soul. Something to set it apart that will help with that, just help me construct a complete narrative through it, and help readers be able to remember, oh yeah, that was this book, that was this book. And so the first book was Kaladin's book, which with a sequence of flashbacks that brought him up to where the book started. And then we did Shallan's book and brought her up to speed on flashbacks. Now we're doing Dalinar's flashbacks, and his stretch back a lot further. If you've read the books, Dalinar's a bit older than the other 2 characters, and he has had quite the past. I wrote those, turned them into my editor with the hope that he would start getting work on editing those, because these are long processes to write. And that's when I sat down and made sure I had my part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4, part 5, which are actually split into 3 books in my head. It's very complicated and weird. And then I wrote part 1 all the way through, and then sent it off for revision. Then I wrote part 2 all the way through, usually by viewpoint group, people who were together. I would write in order, people who weren't, I'd write out of in a different order, sent that off, so far and so forth, until I finally finished it in December of this year. So that was about 18 months from when I wrote the first Kaladin chapter. And then we furiously went into revisions, which I have been doing ever since. Fortunately, I did, while I was working, I actually left out a step. I'd write part 1, then I would revise part 1, and then I'd send it off so that my editor would have a second draft. So we launched immediately into 3rd draft, which is where we are right now. There are still 2 more to do before I turn it in to Tor, so they're starting to panic just a little bit. But I think we'll be fine. I think we're going to meet our deadlines. I do better because I'm going to Europe next month on tour, and I need to have things turned in, at least the third draft done by then. So your options for reading today, we could read one of those Kaladin scenes. They are people, some of you have read them already because I did read them before, and anything I read, people end up sticking online, and I'm okay with that. Now I'm not going to read from it and then not let you do things like that. So you can find that one. We can read from one of the Dalinar flashbacks. They are quite dynamic. They also don't spoil the first two books because they take place chronologically before the first book even starts. They are very exciting and very polished, but I do think I've read one of them here in Boston before when I was on tour for Shadows of Self. Am I right on that? Some people are nodding. So some of you have already heard those, so that might not be as exciting. I also have the prologue to the book, which I can write, which doesn't have very many spoilers because all the prologues for the books take place on the same day. The problem with this one is it has not been edited for continuity. So you might, my assistant and editor are looking at it right now because I often write the first chapters last after I finish a book. Some who follow my writing process have heard me talk about this before. Usually the hardest chapter to write for a book, at least for me, is the first chapter. It's often the first few chapters. I'll try a stab at them, and then after I finish the book, I'll usually throw them away and write again. So one of the one of the last things I wrote in the process was the prologue, which I didn't write until sometime in December, or even later than that. I think I actually wrote that after I turned in the draft. I added the prologue to it. And so it hasn't seen editorial revision yet. I don't know how interesting or exciting it is because no one else has read it before. We can read that, or we can take a goofy interlude. Every Stormlight book has short stories interspersed through it, just around the world of Roshar that have almost nothing to do with what's going on there, tangentially related. I do this because, again, I noticed in epic fantasy series that I love, sometimes the authors would spend a lot of time on interesting side characters, and it feels like it sometimes broke the momentum of the books. And I said, well, obviously we writers need something to let us blow off steam and explore side characters, so I built a structure for it, which is kind of the way I work. I'm an outliner, where I'm going to add these viewpoints in that are just anything I feel like writing, but I've got a limited number of them, and for those who feel like they break the structure or whatnot, they can skip them, read the book and then come back to them, or things like this. Like, usually they are written in such a way that you could read them in any order, anytime you wanted. I do hide clues and things in them to what's going on, so they're not completely irrelevant, but you know, it just lets you know what's coming and lets you, when a break comes, spend some time with side characters, right? Instead of in the middle of someone's dynamic plot where they're about to get to the climax and then boom, side character. So let's, and we might have time to do these, I'm not sure, it depends on how much I blab, but who wants to read Kaladin spoiler chapters? Okay, that's not, okay, we'll put those out. Who wants to read Dalinar flashback chapter? Decent number of you. All right, who wants prologue? Okay, and who wants goofy interlude? Oh, goofy interlude actually won. Okay, we'll do this, and then we will see where we stand. And I thought for sure that prologue would win. Then it had like the second number of votes, so we'll do a revote in a minute. So let's see if I can find this. So one of the things I like to do with these interludes is I like to write things that say, there is an entire world here, and some people living their lives in this world are only tangentially or not at all related to what you've seen. The first book takes place entirely in this place we call the Shattered Plains. Roshar is a big place. It's easy to start thinking, well, what's going on at Shattered Plains is the center of everything, and so I wanted to make sure some of these interludes went other places. We are going to read one of the interludes for Oathbringer, which I think you will enjoy. But I'll warn you, this one's a little on the goofy side. The Yokska Monastery was ordinarily a very quiet place. Nestled in the forests atop a hill on the western slopes of the Horneater Peaks, the place was a paradise that few even knew existed. The peaks themselves blocked the brunt of the storms, and usually the monastery felt only rain at the passing of a high storm. Furious rain, yes, and with some thundering, but none of the terrible destruction one knew in most parts of the world. Alista had to remind herself every passing storm how lucky she was to be here. Ardents in the know often fought half their lives to be transferred here, away from politics, storms, and other annoyances. At Yokska, you could just think. Usually. Are you looking at these numbers? Are your eyes for some reason disconnected from your brain? I saw the numbers, but I'm saying we can't judge yet. 3 instances are not enough. 2 data points make a coincidence. 3 make a sequence. This is plenty. The Everstorm travels at a constant speed, unlike the high storm. You can't possibly say that. One of your data points, so highly touted, is from the original passing of the storm, which happened as an uncommon event. Alista slammed her book closed and gathered up her materials. She burst from her reading nook and gave a glare to the 2 Ardents arguing in the hall outside. They were so involved in their shouting match, they didn't even respond to the glare, though it had been one of her best. Once she'd been able to silence this library with a simple word. Now, the entire place had gone insane. She bustled from the library, entering a long hallway with sides open to the elements outside. Peaceful trees, a quiet brook, humid air, and mossy vines that popped and stretched as they moved, laying out for the evening. Well, yes, a large swath of trees out there had been flattened by the new storm, but that was no reason for everyone to get upset. The rest of the world could worry. Here, she was just supposed to be able to read. She started to set her things out at a reading desk here near an open window. The humidity wasn't good for books, but places where the storms were weak went hand in hand with fecundity. You just had to accept that. Hopefully those new fabrials to draw water from the air would. Telling you, we have to move, a voice echoed through the hallway. Look, the storm is going to ravage these woods. Before long, this slope will be barren, and the storm will be hitting us full force. The building wasn't built to withstand that kind of punishment. But the new storm doesn't have that strong a wind factor, Venom. It's not going to blow down the trees. Have you looked at the measurements? I've disputed those measurements. But, Alista rubbed her temples. Her head was bald, like the head of the other Ardents. Her parents still joked that she'd joined the Ardentias simply because she hated bothering with her hair. She tried earplugs, but could hear the arguing through them. So eventually she picked up her things again and went storming through the monastery. Maybe the basement. Using a sphere for light, she took the long steps down to the lower level. It wasn't truly a basement, just another building constructed further down the slopes. The steps were even outside, down a forested slope. The inaccuracy of calling it a basement bothered her, but the term had been used for as long as anyone could remember. Before arriving at the monastery, she'd had illusions about what it would be like to live among scholars. No bickering, no politicking. Well, she hadn't found that to be true, but generally people did leave her alone. And so she was lucky to be here. She told herself that again as she entered the basement building. It was basically a zoo. Dozens of people gathering information from span reads, talking to one another, buzzing about talk of this high prince or that king. She stopped in the doorway, took it all in for a moment, then turned on her heel and stalked back out. Now what? She started up the steps toward the monastery proper, but lingered halfway there. It's probably the only route to peace, she thought, looking out at the forest. Trying not to think about the dirt, the cremlings, and the fact that something might drip on her head, she strode off into the forest. She didn't want to go too far, as who knew what might be out there. She eventually chose a stump without too much moss on it and settled down, book across her lap, her other materials tucked into her satchel. She could still hear Ardents arguing down below, but they were distant. She opened her book, intent on finally getting something done today. She read. Wemma sprung away from Bright Lord Stirling's forward advances, tucking her safe hand to her breast and lowering her gaze from his comely locks. Such affection as to delight the unsavory mind could surely not satisfy her for an extended period, as though his attentions had at one time been fanciful delights to entertain her leisurely hours, they now seemed to manifest as utter impudence and greatest faults of character. What? Alista exclaimed, reading. No, you silly girl. He's finally pronounced his affection for you. Don't you dare turn away now. Back to the reading. How could she accept this wanton justification of her once single-minded desires? Should she not instead select the more prudent choice as advocated by the undeviating will of her uncle? Bright Lord Vadham had an endowment of land upon the High Prince's grace, and would have means to provide far beyond the satisfactions available to a simple officer, no matter how well regarded or what whims had graced his temperament, features, and a gentle touch. Alyssa gasped. Bright Lord Vadham? You little whore! Have you forgotten about how he locked away your father? Wemma, Bright Lord Stirling intoned, it seems I have gravely misjudged your attentions, and this I find myself deposited deep within an embarrassment of folly. I shall be away to the shattered plains, and you shall not again suffer the torment of my presence. He bowed then a true gentleman's bow, possessing of all the true refinement and difference. It was a supplication beyond what even a monarch could rightly demand, and in it Wemma ascertained the true nature of Bright Lord Stirling's regard, simple yet passionate, respectful indeed. In a move it lent great context to his earlier advance, which now appeared all at once a righteous deviation in otherwise sure armor, a window of vulnerability rather than a model of avarice. As he lifted the door's latch to forever make his exodus from her life, Wemma surged with unrivaled shame and longing, twisting together not unlike two threads winding in a loom to construct a grand tapestry of desire. Wait, Wemma cried. Dear Stirling, wait upon my words. Storm's right, Alyssa muttered. She leaned closer to the book, flipping the page. Decorum seemed a vain thing to her now, lost upon the sea that was her need to feel Stirling's touch. She rushed to him, and upon his arm pressed her ensleeved hand, which then she lifted to caress his sturdy jaw. It was warm out here in the forest, practically sweltering. Alyssa put her hand to her lips, reading with wide eyes, trembling. Would that the window through that statuesque armor could still be located, and a similar wound within herself might be found, to press against his own and offer passage deep within her soul, if only... Alyssa? A voice asked. Yep, she said, bolting upright, snapping the book closed, spinning toward the sound. Oh, Arden Gerv. The young Siln Arden was a tall, gangly, and obnoxiously loud man at times, except apparently when sneaking up on colleagues in the forest. You really should feel ashamed for that. What is it you were studying? He asked. Important works, Alyssa said, then sat on the book. Nothing to mind yourself with. What is it you want? He looked down at her satchel. You were the last one to check out the transcriptions from Benthel's collection on the Dawnchant? The old version? I just wanted to check your progress. Dawnchant, right. They'd been working on that before this storm came, and everyone got distracted. Old Navani Colin and Alethar had somehow come up with a key for translations. Her story about visions was nonsense, most likely. The Colin family was known for opaque politics, but the key was authentic, letting them slowly work through what the old text had once said. She started digging through her satchel. She came up with 3 musty codices and a sheaf of paper, the latter being the work she'd done so far. Annoyingly, he settled down on the ground beside her stump, taking the papers as she offered them. He laid his satchel across his lap and began reading. Incredible, he said a few moments later. You've made way more progress than I have. Everyone else is too busy worrying about that storm. Well, it is threatening to wipe out civilization as we know it. An overreaction. Everyone always overreacts to every little gust of wind. That's easy for us to say. It's tucked away in the mountains like this. He flipped through her pages. What's this section? Why take so much care about the origins of the pieces found? Focusing concluded that these books had all spread from a central location, and so there's nothing to learn by where they ended up. Focusing was a bootlicker, not a scholar, Alyssa said. Look, there's easy proof that the same writing system was once used all across Roshar. I have references to Macabacum, Solitales, Alethabla, not just the diaspora of text, but real evidence they wrote naturally in the Dawnchant. Do you suppose they all spoke the same language? Hardly. But Yasna Colin's relics. doesn't claim that everyone spoke the same language, only that they wrote it. It's foolish to assume that everyone used the same language across hundreds of years and dozens of nations. It makes more sense that there was a codified written language, a language of early scholarship, just like you'd find many underscripts written in Alethi now, even if the scribe was originally Vedic. Ah, he said, and then a desolation hit. Alyssa nodded, showing him a page later in her sheaf of notes. This in-between weird language is where the people started using the Don chant script to phonetically transcribe their language. It didn't work so well. She flipped 2 more pages. After the next desolation, we have the Proto-Voran alphabet emerging, and Thalen a century later. We've always wondered what happened to the Don chant. Well, it seems clear now. They lost the knowledge of writing in the Don chant because of the days of the Recreants. Or because by the days of the Recreants, it had already become a dead language for millennia. It was easy to forget because they weren't speaking it, as they hadn't been in generations. Brilliant, Gerv said. He wasn't so bad, actually, for a Silm. All of this, he said, because of the madman's ravings. He pulled a sheaf of his own paper out from the satchel. We've been translating what we can. We're getting close to really cracking this thing, I think. If what you've been doing here is correct, that's because Kovad isn't a true Don chant, but a phonetic transcription from another ancient language. He glanced aside, then cocked his head. He glanced aside, then cocked his head. Was he looking at her? Oh, no, it was just the book, which she was still sitting on. An Accountability of Virtue, he grunted. Good book. You've read it? I have a fondness for Alethi epics, he said absently, flipping through her pages. She really should have picked Vadim, though. Sterling was a flatterer in a cage. Sterling is a noble and upright officer. She narrowed her eyes. And you are just trying to get a rise out of me, ardent Gerv. Maybe. He flipped through her pages, studying a diagram she'd made of various Don chant grammars. I have a copy of the sequel. There's a sequel? About her sister. The mousy one? She is elevated to courtly attention and has to choose between a strapping naval officer, a Thalen banker, and the king's wit. 3 men? Sequels always have to be bigger, I said. Then offered her the stack of pages back. I'll lend it to you. For what? For help in translating a particularly stubborn section of Don chant. I have a patron of mine who has a strict deadline upon its delivery. And there you go. I warned you it was good news. So yeah, those are the sorts of things that end up in these interludes. Discussions of linguistics for those linguistic nerds out there, and discussions of other things for those romance novel nerds out there. It's whatever I feel like writing at the time, and what parts of the world I want to highlight, and what's going on with them, that sort of stuff. I really do enjoy them, but they're a little self-indulgent, I'll admit. Let's do a couple of questions, and then we'll see if there's something else to read. Yeah, go ahead.
What happens when you compound copper?
What happens when you compound copper? I'm going to raffle that for now. I am dealing with the various interactions of the various magics slowly on purpose to dole out information so that I have cool stuff to talk about in future books. Go ahead. Did Ambition ever have a shard world of their own? Meaning, did Ambition settle on a planet? I'll raffle that too. Sorry, I have raffle cards you guys can come get if you want. Raffle, for those who don't know, means read and find out. It means I'm not going to answer that right now. We'll go back here and then we'll work our way over here.
How is it that you're able to write such real and strong women characters that are, feminist in their own way and in very different ways from book to book? Is it your wife your inspiration, or can you do a workshop for other writers?
This is a huge compliment, and thank you. It is something that I've worked on a long time. I would blame the authors I read getting into fantasy, namely Anne McCaffrey, Mel Neuron, and Barbara Hamley. They were the first 3 authors I read. If you came to my panel yesterday, I talked about this. And I internalized some of the things they were talking about. I also do have some good models. My mother graduated in accounting, first in her class in the year where she was the only woman in the accounting department. And she's currently the accountant for the city of Idaho Falls. And so getting it wrong was a big deal to me, and I did get it wrong in my first few books, the unpublished ones, fortunately. What I realized was it was a bigger problem than just doing the female characters wrong, but though that was the biggest sign that I was doing something wrong. What was happening was I was writing people to roles in the story rather than writing them as people who ended up having a role in the story. And that sounds really simple, right? But once I realized, people don't see themselves as the plucky sidekick, usually. People don't see themselves as the romantic interest. People see themselves as a person who plays a part of their life in someone else's life, but plays a different part over here and plays a different part over here. And those of us who, are extroverts might be introverts in some situations where we don't know much, and those of us who are introverts might be extroverts when you put us in front of a room and tell us to do a reading. We're like, yeah, I can handle that. We all fulfill lots of different roles in different settings in different people's lives, and everybody has motivations and passions, and gender identity and racial factors and your upbringing and all of these things and your culture. These are parts of who you are, but when you let one of those things define you too much, you become a flat character in fiction, is what I mean. I often use kind of separating this from some of the baggage. There's a character, you guys ever seen the TV show Lost? It's getting kind of old now. Back in the day, this was a better example when everyone had seen it. But in the TV show Lost, there's a character who loses his son. If you've ever watched it, in the first season, his son gets kidnapped by the bad guys. And normally you would say, this is a really good motivation for a character, right? Someone that he loves has been taken, and he wants to get this character back, right? And it's kind of like writing 101. Give the character a personal stake, make them passionate about something, make them active. Great, except most people in our watching group hated this character. And it went online. If you went online, people were like, we hate this character. And I thought a long time about why was it? It's because the character had one note and one side. The other characters would get together and basically say, okay, we're all starving, we need to get lunch. What ideas do you have? And one's like, let's climb trees to get lunch. Let's raid this thing over here to get lunch. And then they go to this guy and it's like, my son is missing. They're like, all right, dude, yes, lunch. My son, right? And I'm exaggerating that, but it felt like that every time. And so something that was well done became a one-note thing because he filled only one role in the plot. I must find my son. And when you're writing people to just a role like that, you end up with these flat characters. You end up with people who don't really live. And so I think the first big revelation for me was that I was doing that. And this was particularly true of the female characters. Like when you start writing, it's very normal to just write a protagonist who's much like yourself. And then writing people who aren't like yourself, you're like, well, this is this role, this is this role, this is this role, and then boom. But there was something else I had to learn, which I think is, there's still lots of things for me to learn, but there was something else big that I had to learn. And this was the problem that I've only recently begun reading essays about it, which is that the natural inclination of someone is first off to kind of write everyone, because we have to practice, as kind of a stereotype or whatnot, and then you learn, you get better. But then our next inclination is to write the person who is different from ourselves as like super, super awesome. Right? Just so that we're not accidentally being sexist, right? And you'll see this a lot too. And this happens a lot with African Americans and things in video games in particular. I don't know if you guys have ever seen this, but I was playing a video game once, right? And it's a bunch of burly white guys who are like awesome with guns and they're killing stuff, and they talk about their friend, the black guy. You don't know he's black at the time, but like, oh, our friend. And then, they get into trouble and they can't save themselves. And then like the black guy bursts through the ceiling with guns blazing, mows down all the enemies, says, all right guys, go for it, and then runs off into the sunset, right? He's like the coolest guy ever. He only stopped short of doing a rap song for the end song, right? It's like just everything, but they don't want to be racist, so he's awesome. But he also doesn't get a character arc, right? Everybody else has deep character arcs and is messed up. They didn't want to, and I understand this instinct, they didn't want to make the black guy messed up because he's the minority, and they were so worried about screwing it up that instead they put him on a pedestal. And you see guys do this with women too, and you see women do this with the men characters. If you read a book, often you'll be like, the guy, by a female character, the guy has very few faults. He's just this guy, and the woman is like this messed up, like neurotic, interesting character. And it's the same with the verse of the guys. The girl, the woman in the book ends up being the one who is very, very responsible, right? Who's like, we need to go do this, the kick-ass, strong female character, quote unquote, right? Where she's just like awesome, but doesn't have a character arc and isn't messed up in the ways that make people interesting. And so that's another level, right? Is when you're like, we have to make all the characters interesting and all the characters messed up and individual, rather than even doing that level. And that one's been even harder to kind of internalize and figure out how to do. I can't give you a big lesson on how to do that, but I do have my writing lectures, and I do talk about stuff like this occasionally. So hopefully that's some insight into the journey I've been on to try to figure out how to do this right. All right, yes?
So at this point, a lot of your work has been optioned, and I was wondering if you maybe be interested in some of it being like a serious animated TV show versus live action.
So yeah.
Maybe that might also work for real time.
So serious animated television show instead of live action. I would be totally on board, except for one thing. There is no market for it worldwide. There are markets in very small places, but so far every animated thing in the US and in large parts of the world as well has either been something like The Simpsons, which is comedy, or whatnot. That can work for adults, they'll watch that. Or it's been child-focused with some hidden depth of themes, like The Last Airbender, right? Which is the quintessential example, right? If I could get a television show as good as that done on one of my books, I'd love it. But nobody's going to finance it because there isn't an audience for it unless you pretend it's a children's show. And there's nothing wrong with being a children's show, right? But this is how Pixar has figured out how to do its things. It makes movies that everyone will love. But anytime someone tries to even make a teen-focused one, it's like a huge disaster. Treasure Planet was an example of this, which is famous in Hollywood for kind of being a disaster, even though it's a fun movie. And so until maybe US audiences grow up in their treatment of the animation, it's not a realistic thing because the cost to earnings, like I can't just say, okay, yeah guys, spend $50 million on this. I know it'll only make 5, but it'll be really cool, right? So maybe if your aunt is an executive at Netflix, you can tell her to maybe they could be on the forefront of this. But until then, we are looking at traditional television. Well, not traditional television. New format, right? Netflix style, complete season stuff, Stranger Things type stuff, or traditional feature film. Those are our goals right now. All right, right here.
So in a less spoilerific context in the here.
Okay, don't spoil too much for people who haven't read it. Yeah.
Well, for your own pleasure as an author, with so many characters using so many different kinds of magic and different combat situations, do you ever take some of them out of context, stack them, and pitch them against each other just to see what will happen? A Windrunner versus a Lurcher?
I work on the math of it and their power within their own context. I don't actually write out versus scenes because I really feel like versus scenes depend on context so much. People love this in fandom, and I love this in fandom. Who would win, X or Y? The problem is, as a writer, you're like, well, who would win? What's the context? right? Who would win, Kelsier or, I wrote one, Kelsier versus Moiraine for like some goofy online thing where they were doing a championship, and they both just talked about the fact that they can't, right? Because if Kelsier finds her while she's sleeping, he assassinates her. If he goes to her directly in combat, she vaporizes him. But what's the context? Context. Kelsier is never going to face Moiraine in a battle where she can hit him with weaves and blow him apart. Moiraine is never going to go to sleep somewhere if she knows Kelsier is hunting her, where somebody could find her, right? And so it's this sort of thing like when you write characters, you're going to write them so that they play to their strengths, and so that the context matters a whole lot, you know? That there are certain implications to a Windrunner doing something against his oaths with someone else could manipulate to force him to have to lose, even though he might actually have won, and stuff like this. So no, I don't do that, but I am planning crossovers in the Cosmere, which eventually will explore some of these ideas.
Thank you.
All right, let's go to the way back there.
Hi, is there a question about the Stormlight archives that you've always wanted to answer
Oh, what a good question. The answer to that is no, because they are so good at asking these questions. They ran through all of those years ago. Though I will say it was really fun. For those who don't know, all of my epic fantasy books are connected behind the scenes, right? There's a secret epic connecting them. I can talk a minute about where this came from, because I'll tell a little story here. It's hard to reach back and credit where exactly the idea came from. The first thing I can think of as a proto version of why this happened was I was reading Anne McCaffrey books, which I love, and I was starting to get very imaginative and feel like I want to be a writer. So I'm 17 years old, I'm like, I want to do this, and I started adding my own character to her books. So someone would come on stage that's nameless and would do a report. In my imagination, my headcanon was that was a different person, and there was a story going on behind the scenes that none of the main characters in the book knew about. And this character started making appearances in every book I read. Like there's a hidden epic back here that's all interconnected. Around the same time, I finally read Asimov, the Foundation series, and really liked it. Particularly how he tied the robots and the Foundation books together later in his career, which I thought was really cool. There were some things that were a little clunky about it because he feels like he decided it after the fact to make this come together, but it was super cool. And I started to see that this had been done by other people, and one of my thoughts was, what if you did it from the get-go, right? What if you stood on the shoulders of giants and used what they had already practiced, and you used it to create something behind the scenes that was woven through from the first book. That was really exciting to me. And when I had started writing my own books, I had started adding this character into my own books, cameos, just like I did when I was reading other people's books. When I started writing, I wrote 5 books as practice, and then the 6th book, Elantris, is where I said, I think I know what I'm doing, and it's where I first started developing the Cosmere in earnest. Before that, I'd had ideas and things, but that's where I said, I'm writing this book, we're going to do the Cosmere. Here's Hoyd, and here's what he's up to behind the scenes for me, and here's the larger story. I wrote that, and then I started to work on Dragonsteel, which is the prequel to the Cosmere, and White Sand around this time, which were the first 3 Cosmere books. So your question, I actually am getting to this. No, they asked me everything. But what was really cool, tangential to your question, was when people started to get it. Because you can go back and read the forums that the early proto Brandon Sanderson fan forums, before there were actual Brandon Sanderson fan forums, it started on a website that my friends started just for us to hang out on, and there was a section for each of our writing because we were all aspiring writers, and I happened to get published first. So then people started showing up on that forum that we didn't know, which we thought was really cool. And then people started to notice Hoyd. It was around Hero of Ages era, that they started to notice this. And reading their responses to this was super fun. And then within a year, they had started pulling all the question answers out of me. So we're about 10 years too late. Nowadays, I have to work hard to even keep ahead of them. All right, let's do one more question, and then I'll do another short reading. Go ahead.
You're such a word machine. One would think that you're always chained to your desk or you're behind the dais here. Talk about travel a little bit. Do you ever get to travel? Does travel inform your experience for that little vignette you did to go to Sinai or Kyoto for the monastery?
Right, good question. So I travel a lot. I enjoy traveling. It's a little hard on my schedule, one might imagine, but I really do like it. That little vignette, I did go to Japan. Actually, it was on my trip to Taiwan. I sell really well in Taiwan, and so Taiwan brings me out periodically for signings. We stopped for a day in Japan to hike monasteries specifically, and we hiked several of them. We hiked the one that's right next to the airport, that is the one that's outside the city. I'm trying to remember what that is. But then we went into the downtown Tokyo and hiked one of the ones in there, just so I could, So I like this, and you see the pictures I took. By the way, the coolest thing were these big rocks that they had inscribed quotes in, anciently, just piled on top of each other and things like this. I love that. But yes, I travel a lot. It does inform my writing a lot. Famously, The Emperor's Soul came after I went to Taiwan one time. Snapshot came after a trip to Dubai. You can't find as much Dubai in Snapshot as you can find in Taiwan and Emperor's Soul. But traveling, just some mix of things happens to me. I usually write my novellas as a response to a trip or just taking a break for the trip and things like that. That happened to Legion. It happened to most of the novellas. So let's go ahead and do another reading. We got about 15 minutes here, I believe. Who now, you only vote once, but if you voted before, you can re-vote. Who wants to hear Kaladin? Not many people, who won't go there. Who wants to hear Dalinar? Raise your hands. Okay, and who wants to hear the prologue? Raise your hands. Okay, all right, prologue it is. You can read the Dalinar chapters online or even watch videos of me reading them on tour. So, the prologue. As I mentioned, the prologues of each of the books in the Stormlight Archive take place on the same day, from different viewpoints. It's one of these kind of fun, non-linear things that authors indulge themselves in once in a while. And this one is from Eshonai's viewpoint. So if you haven't read the first book, it's okay, I'll give you a little primer because it's in the first chapter. It's not that much of a spoiler. There is a guy there named the Assassin in White, and he assassinates the king of one of the most militaristic and dangerous kingdoms in the world. And they rightly go ballistic for this, and it is thought that the new allies of these people, the Alethi, that they had discovered, that they signed a treaty with, are behind the assassination. So this is from the viewpoint of one of these new people they had discovered, made a treaty with on the night of the assassination, before it happens. Eshonai had always told her sister that she was certain something wonderful lay over the next hill. And then one day she crossed that hill and found aliens. Strange and wonderful creatures who spoke a guttural language with no discernible rhythms, but who created beauty all the same. They wore clothing as vibrant as any carapace, though they couldn't grow their own armor, and were so terrified of the storms they hid inside tombs of rock or wood, even when traveling. Most remarkable, they had only one form. It seemed to Eshonai at first that these creatures, these Alethi, must have forgotten their forms, as the listeners had. That built an instant kinship between them, that and the fact that they seemed to have adopted another group of listeners who had somehow lost their forms, and the humans had begun taking care of them so that the poor souls without songs would not hurt themselves. Oh, how innocent those first meetings had been. Eshonai went with the drummers to gather their instruments. She had never quite understood what her purpose was to be this night when the Alethi and the listeners dined to celebrate their contract together. She was a scout, a hunter, but also their foremost expert on the Alethi. She wasn't one of the five, but neither was she a lowly farmer. She was important tonight, yet not so important that she couldn't be spared for some menial labor. She was glad for that. She hummed to awe as she helped unload the drums from the cart behind the choles. She had never wished for authority. People with authority couldn't go chasing the horizon. But if being an expert brought her to this wonderful place, then she would accept it. This wonderful, terrible place. She handed a drum to Hermel, feeling dwarfed by the palace structure. The humming sounds of her people working echoed in this cavernous unloading dock on the western side of the palace. It was so large it could accommodate their entire caravan. 200 listeners had packed in here during their first arrival and hadn't even filled the place. Indeed, most of the listeners couldn't attend the feast upstairs, but the Alethi had seen to their refreshment anyway, providing mountains of food and drink for the group down here. So wonderful. This palace was what the buildings at the center of the Shattered Plains must have looked like before being weathered by the storms. The sheer engineering prowess of the city beyond, with its clustered buildings and enormous walls, made her revise, yet again, her understanding of these creatures they'd met. She stepped off the wagon, looking up at the reaches of the building, humming to excitement. When she told her mother she was determined to map the world itself, she'd imagined a place of natural discovery, canyons and hills, forests and lakes overgrown with life. And yet, all along, this had been out there, waiting just beyond their reach. And so had more listeners. A population that was not just some little tribe lacking songs, an enormous, mind-numbing population of people like her own, but silent, and owned by the humans. They keep wanting to come help, Git-Geth said, handing her a drum. They want to be near us. They sense that something is wrong with their minds, I tell you. Eshni accepted the drum and set it with the others. A group of parshmen, as they were called, clustered around the outside of their ring of workers. They'd been sent to help with the drums and had been forbidden by their masters to participate in the festivities going on nearby, where listeners feasted. The Alethi wanted to make very sure there was a line between their slaves and their new allies. What to make of this idea? People who could be bought and sold? Clave, one of the five, had gone to the slavers in the city and purchased a person to see if it was truly possible, and it had been depressingly easy. There had even been a Alethi for sale. Apparently, parshmen were expensive and considered high-quality slaves. The listeners had been told this, as if it, for some reason, was supposed to make them feel proud. She hummed to curiosity and nodded to Git-Geth, who smiled and hummed to peace. Everyone was used to Eshni wandering off in the middle of jobs to be done. It wasn't that she was unreliable. Well, maybe she was, but at least consistently so. She walked up to the parshmen and hummed a song to them, the song of Huns, hummed to excitement. They, like all the others she'd tried talking to, just looked at her with hollow eyes. They wore slave form, at least that's what the listeners had decided to call it. Really, it wasn't a form at all, but a lack of one. They seemed like dull form, but dull forms could hear the rhythms, and these could obviously not. Eshni herself wore work form instead of war form. The armor of war form could be handy on a hunt, but work form was more freeing. She liked the way she thought in work form. She wandered away from the parshmen, walking up the steps and entering the palace, trying to take in the ornamentation, the beauty, the sheer overwhelming wonder of the palace. Beautiful and terrible. People were bought and sold, and that kept this place clean. But was that what freed the humans to create great works like the carvings on the pillars she passed or the inlaid marble patterns on the floor? She passed soldiers who wore their metal carapace. Humans hadn't lost their forms. They had only one. Always in mate form, work form, and war form all at once. They wore their emotions on their faces far more than the listeners. Oh, Eshni's people would smile and laugh and cry, but not like these Alethi, who were perpetually held enslaved to their emotions. Perhaps that's where they'd gotten the idea. The lower levels of the palace had an open field to them. Broad hallways and galleries lit by spheres with carefully cut gemstones that made light sparkle, as opposed to the uncut stones her people tended to wear. Sparkling chandeliers hung above her, broken suns spraying light all around. She trailed up the steps, holding a hardwood banister polished so deeply it reflected her face. Let me see my time. Okay, we got some time. How strange it was that the listeners, with their varied faces and skin, should be the ones who could control themselves to a single form, while the Alethi, who seemed so dull with their tan skins, should be the ones so vibrant with emotion. Perhaps the simple ways they looked was another reason they sought to ornament everything, from their clothing to the pillars that held up the roofs. Could we do this, she thought, humming to appreciation, if we knew the right form for creating art? The upper floors of the palace were more tunnel-like, tight stone corridors, rooms like bunkers dug into a mountainside. She made her way back toward the feast hall, but with diversions, glancing into rooms, making a mental map in her head. If they were going to give her free reign of the palace, she'd take it and learn everything she could. As long as she was back for the music, Clave and the others wouldn't complain. They were as accustomed to her ways as everyone else. She was always wandering off, poking into things, peeking into doors, and finding the king? Eshonai froze, door cracked, as she looked in at a lush room with a thick red rug and bookshelves all around. So much information just laying around, casually ignored. That was the king himself standing in front of the table, pointing at something on it, surrounded by a group of 5 Alethi in uniforms or long dresses. Why wasn't he at the feast? Why weren't there guards at the door? Eshonai attuned anxiety and pulled back, but not before one of the women inside prodded King Gavilar in the arm and pointed toward Eshonai. Rhythm pounding in her head, she pulled the door closed, but a moment later a tall man in a uniform stepped out. The king would like to see you, the man said. She spoke their language pretty well these days, but she pretended not to. Sir, she cocked her head. Words? Don't be coy, the soldier said. You're the interpreter. Come in. You aren't in any trouble. Nervous, she let him lead her into the den. Thank you, Meridas, Gavilar said. He turned to the others. They filed out, leaving Eshonai at the door, attuning constellation and humming it loudly as she could, even though the humans wouldn't understand what it meant. Eshonai, the king said, I have something to show you. He knew her name? She wasn't aware the king had been paying that close attention to them. She had spent most of her time speaking with his scribes, trying and failing to explain the rhythms to them. She stepped further into the small, warm room, holding her arms tightly to her. She didn't understand this man. It was more than his alien, dead way of speaking, more than the fact that she couldn't anticipate what emotions might be swirling in there as war form and mate form warred inside of him. More than any human, this man baffled her. What did he want? Why had he offered them such a nice treaty? At first, it seemed like an accommodation between tribes. That was before she'd come here, seen the city, watched their armies patrol the streets. Her people had once been like this. She knew that from the Psalms. Once possessed cities of their own and armies to envy. That had been long ago. They were a fragment of a lost people, traitors who had abandoned their gods to be free. This man could have crushed them and taken their shards, the few weapons they had passed down from ancient times. Why did he smile at her like that? What was he hiding inside by not singing to the rhythms to calm her? Sit, Eshonai, the king said. Oh, don't be frightened, little scout. I've been wanting to speak to you. Your mastery of our language is unique. She settled down on the seat before him. She couldn't see what was on the table. Some papers he'd been studying. He reached down to remove something small from a satchel at his feet. It glowed with red stormlight, a construction of gemstones and metal, crafted in a beautiful design. Do you know what this is? He asked, gently pushing it toward her. No, Your Majesty. It's what we call a fabrial. It's a little device powered by stormlight that does something handy. In this case, it makes warmth. Just a smidge, unfortunately. My wife is confident her scholars can create one that will heat a room. Wouldn't that be wonderful? No more fires and hearths. It seemed lifeless to Eshonai, but she didn't say so. She hummed to praise so that he'd be happy telling her this and handed it back. Look closely, King Gavilar said. Look deep into it. Can you see that thing moving inside? It's a spread. That's how the device works. Captive, like in a gem heart, she thought, attuning awe. They built devices that somehow mimic how we apply the forms. The humans did so much with their limitations. The chasm fiends aren't your gods, are they? He asked. What? She said, attuning skepticism. Why ask that? What a strange turn in the conversation. Oh, it's just something I've been thinking about, he said, taking the fabrial back. The others feel so superior as they think they've figured it out, but I know the truth. He chuckled. They think you're savages. You're not savages. You're a little enclave of memories, a window into the past. He leaned forward, ruby light slipping between his fingers. I'm going to help you, Eshonai. Did you know I figured out how to bring your gods back? And I will stop there. That's not the end of the scene, I'm sorry, but we are out of time. I am going down to a signing right now. I'll be happy to chat with you and answer questions there. Thank you guys very much.